welcome to a brand new episode of the Jedi Way here on the Outlaw Nation channel. Really excited to be diving in to a spoiler review episode for episode 3 of the Acolyte, the much debated, argued about, controversial episode here. We're going to break it all down. Let's introduce ourselves. I am the Outlaw John Rocha, sometimes known as Rocha Fed around these parts, joined as always by the great Laura Kelly, the co-host of Force Toast Pod, co-host here, and also a High Republic expert, shall we say. Laura, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Love the background.
Thank you. I'm bringing Coruscant back tonight. I'm doing great. I'm excited. It's been a fun week on Star Wars Twitter for me. I feel like I don't have like a ton of the toxicity and the negativity of that section of the fandom and their thoughts on the Acolyte coming at me. So I really can't complain, to be honest. I'm doing great.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I like what you said. I'm bringing Coruscant back. Anyway, we are getting into episode 3 here. This is directed by Kogonada, who had directed After Yang and Columbus. It's a reunion with him and Jodie Turner-Smith, who we finally meet in this particular episode. This is a flashback episode, Laura, and so much happened in this episode that we just got to dive into it and get your initial thoughts here. We get more. This is entire flashback episode. There's not even a modern thing we're flashing back to. We immediately start 16 years later on Brendok, and we see the story of what happened from a certain point of view, shall we say, between Mae and Osha, these coven of witches, the 4 Jedi that are being hunted by Mae right now in the real time, modern time of the show. And we get to meet these women and their approaches to what is the Force for the Jedi, but what is a thread to them. And then by the end, we get to see the fire that was supposedly caused by Mae, and we see Osha commit herself to possibly be Soul's Padawan, which we know will happen later on down the road. And we end with Mae there at the tree. So your thoughts overall on this particular episode and what you thought of it?
I mean, I'm kind of in the same position I was probably last week. Like, my thoughts on the show overall haven't really changed. And I was kind of hoping that this episode would pick up a little bit for me and draw me in a little bit more. And not that it didn't. I didn't think it was bad. It just there wasn't like a hook for me. And that's what I struggled with with the episodes 1 and 2 as well. I do think it was a really interesting choice that this show pulled everybody in by giving us these great characters in episodes 1 and 2, and then left them out of episode 3 completely. Like, I get that it's a flashback and Yord and Jecki couldn't be in it, but to not have any scenes set in the present day seems a little bit, it seems questionable to me. It's a questionable decision. So I feel like you have to connect it back to the now, or like the present day. Has that stopped the Yord Horde tweets from flooding my timeline? It absolutely has not. And so I'm frankly happy to see that. But I do just think it was a really interesting structural decision. I mean, what were your thoughts on that choice? Do you think, I don't know. I feel like I'm a little bit at a loss. What do you think?
Yeah, I actually was, I'm a fan of flashback episodes, especially in a murder mystery type of situation. The Death and Other Details just wrapped up season 1 a few weeks ago on Hulu, and sadly it was canceled, but I kind of liked walking back into a murder mystery episode where you were going back and forth in time. So I take your point, this idea of needing to have some check back in with the modern time and see little things cueing you into those flashbacks and what have you. But I wonder if Leslie did this because there isn't a real commitment to that I think that we're going to hear multiple points of views of what happened. And I think this is the initial point of view from Osha's perspective, mostly from what we are looking at here. She's the one that's the hero of the story in this particular telling of what happened there. She's the one that wants to break out. She's being suffocated by the coven. She doesn't want to do the ascension. Mae is a mean person who uses the Force in a negative way, wants to be around her all the time, wants to share things all the time with her. And then Mae's the Osha's the one that connects to Soul quickly and connects to Kelnaka and can't lie in the test and goes off with the Jedi by the end. Sadly, after watching or seeing that the entire coven is dead, including her 2 mothers possibly, and so it was all told from her point of view. So to me, I think I understand why Leslie Headland wanted to go this route, because I think she wants to lay the groundwork for the basic idea of understanding what happened here, because I think we're going to get little mini flashbacks that go back to certain sections of this flashback that give us a different perspective about what happened here. And I see so many people holding on to this thing saying they've ruined canon, they've changed canon. This is all from a certain person's perspective. So we don't know how much of this is actually accurate until the end of the series, in my opinion. And so to me, I think it's a little bit of knee-jerk reacting to this kind of thing without waiting to see what the overall story was. But I don't think I had the issue with it that you did, but I can absolutely understand where you're coming from in terms of, we just met these characters and now we don't get to see them again until the 4th episode, which I can understand with an 8-episode series can be quite frustrating.
Yeah, and I think that's part of my other issue with this show. And I've brought this up in sort of a different way last week, but I think it was maybe a mistake to do the one at a time with this series.
Oh,
I'm really wishing that that Disney would be willing to
Mhm.
try the sort of Netflix model that they've been using recently, which is dropping half of the season one day and a month later dropping the second half.
Oh,
If we had gotten the first 4 episodes in one, I feel like I might be a little bit more on board. I might be a
yeah.
little bit more with the momentum. At the moment, I still feel a little bit just like I just need something to kind of hook me, and I don't necessarily have that. Now, that said, I really, for the most part, I enjoyed this episode. That kind of big picture stuff is the stuff that I have an issue with.
Yeah.
This episode individually, I thought was really cool. I think the production design is great. I really liked being in the woods. I thought that the fortress itself was very cool. And I really liked being with the witches and being around all of this weird Force stuff. Like, that was kind of fun. Jodie Turner-Smith is
Oof.
amazing in this episode. I feel like even if you didn't like this episode like at all, you would have to admit that like she killed it and knocked it
Mhm.
out of the park, and that was really exciting. So I am hoping that we get another flashback at some point in the series so that we can just get more of her, to be honest. So I don't want to sound like I'm coming down too hard on it or I'm being too negative. I really, for the most part, I enjoyed it. I
Yeah.
think there's some big picture thing here that's just not really working for me yet. And I feel like if I had more at one time, I wouldn't necessarily be in that position. But I don't
Sure.
know what worked for you specifically in this episode.
Well, before we get into that, I just want to, unfortunately, I did not say this at the beginning of the show, and I apologize to everybody who's watching or listening. Kevin Smets couldn't join us tonight because he had a last-minute family emergency, and if you want to send some positive thoughts to Kevin's way, I would suggest you guys do that from the Jedi Way. Suggest you send some positive thoughts, and Kevin said he'll be back next week, but unfortunately couldn't join us for this conversation. So just want to kind of answer the questions that we might be having here in the first few minutes of our review. So you asked me the things that that worked for me. I enjoyed the Coven of Witches. I really, now, did I like the Black Box Theater singing and the choir? No, I did not like that. But I understood this idea of, look, we want to create our own thing. We're going to separate ourselves out from the Jedi and from anything in the New Republic. Brendok's not part of the New Republic. This is safe for us to create our stuff. But the Jedi are here. And what are the Jedi doing? Why is Soul behind a tree? Why are we hearing about where the Jedi ship is if it's moving more inland? Why are we hearing all of these things? And then why are they coming in to question us about our children? And then the conversation of like, well, how were these children made? We get these allusions from Aniseya of how this happened. And Coral, Mother Coral there, I thought that was a fantastic change of pace and an interesting way to introduce these new characters into Star Wars. In essence, like a sect, S-E-C-T, of the Dathomir, the Night Sisters. Like, this is a different situation. They have the dark power. They allude to the fact that some people might think we wield dark power and want to question us. So I like that there were challenges here of the Jedi's way of approach to things from a different point of view. And so I appreciated that. I think people are way too precious about the Jedi because there's numerous examples of the Jedi messing shit up all through the prequels, Clone Wars, the books. You see that Jedi become Sith all the time. So this idea that somehow the Jedi are untouchable as a force, I think is nonsense. And I think the idea of here being at the end of the High Republic and hearing how Aniseya says to them, like, you know, you're essentially the arm of the Republic, and what you're doing is Indara quoting the Republic regulations. That shows you this is not a Jedi that is living like Buddhist monks. This is a Jedi that is an arm of the government at the time. And That's a fascinating thing. So I enjoyed these questioning of the Jedi and being introduced to these new characters here in Star Wars.
Yeah, getting the sort of feel of the geopolitical situation and those ties
Mm.
between the Republic and the Jedi, I think is really interesting. I think it's the way that they've presented it is a really good connector between what we're getting in the High Republic novels, which is very much like the Jedi at the top of their game. They're very much like held in this position of glory,
Yeah.
and you've got some portions of the galaxy that it feels a little bit like colonizing. They're going out into these parts of the not
Mm.
republic to try and get them to join the republic, and some of that feels a little bit iffy, but for the
Yeah.
most part they're a very positive force in the galaxy. But then
Yeah.
we to have this as the sort of in between to bridge that in what we get eventually in the prequels, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that train of thought and that process of how the Jedi get from A to B to C is making a lot of sense to me, and
Yeah.
it is really interesting to see them um not in the best light in this
Mhm.
in this point of view. As you say, we don't know for sure exactly if this is
Right.
how everything went down, if our narrator is 100% reliable or not. But yeah, the fact that Indara comes up there and starts to say Republic Law States, I'm like, girl, like, just I feel like the Jedi just need to mind your own business in this situation. Like, just bail. Like, let's just
Yeah.
I don't know. But it is interesting to watch. I like seeing that connection there.
Yeah, I thought it was an advanced conversation to have about this idea, as we do nowadays, about organizations and cults. And like Coral calls them what, a bunch of monks or space monks or whatever she says there. And it's that perception of, hey, they're coming in to enforce their laws on our thing. There's two ways you can look at it, right? If your thing, do you think is a pure thing and is its own thing and doesn't want to mess with anybody else, even though they're creating, creating life. So there's questions to be asked here. You can say, look, we're living our own life. We don't want to mess with anything. We don't want to mess around with anything. We're just here. Leave us alone. And from the other side, you look at the Jedi and go, well, there's might be possible danger here in what you're doing, messing with what we seem to be getting from Mae and Osha, which is the dark and light side of the Force. What did you create here that could cause future damage to the universe, to the galaxy? What is going on? So you want to find out just in case this could lead to something terrible, right? I liken it to the Hitler situation, right? Would you kill Hitler as a baby if you could? So it feels like they sense maybe there's a darkness in Mae, not necessarily in Osha. So they're trying to figure out what's going on here. But you can't ignore the fact that they're coming in and essentially saying, we have a right to test your children. And then, of course, with your permission, of course, that kind of like
Oh yeah.
disclaimer that doesn't really mean what she says she's saying there. It's more a matter of, because if you don't give us permission, then it's going to be trouble for you. And look, I know we want to love the Jedi and all, but it is very possible that they also want to recruit people into their ranks because they're thinning out and people, and maybe it's an issue where they want to cover more ground. And so they want to recruit more people. Why do you think every single Jedi that's taken comes from a willing family and a happy kid? These things can be quite difficult. And so I like that. Again, Leslie was asking questions of the Jedi here throughout this episode, but as I said earlier, from a certain point of view, you know?
Well, exactly. And we've got, we're questioning at this point, like, was it really the right thing that Jedi are going around to
Mm.
all of these families and taking their young children to eventually become Padawans? But I think the other side of that question is, did these kids consent to being in this witch's coven
Right.
in this cult?
Oh,
No. I
good
mean,
point.
the answer is no.
Absolutely.
So they were raised in it and they were ingrained in it, but kids can't
Right.
consent to being members of a cult. So it's they're in a difficult position, and I think that the way that the story is going, it's going to be a lot about choice. We
Yeah.
see that this is Osha's choice of wanting to go with the Jedi,
Yeah.
and how she goes from being this 8-year-old that's very enthusiastic about it to being this 20-something girl that washes out of the Jedi. I'll be very curious to see how that plays out and if we actually get into that story. I mean, we're 3 episodes in, there's only 5 left. You got a lot of ground to cover if you want to cover this sort of murder mystery from all these different points of view.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get curious about what things are going to actually be pushed to season 2 and what we're going to be able to fit into this first season.
I think that'll be dangerous to push anything to season 2 that is massive, because people are already waiting to cut this thing up to pieces if you don't
Oh
give
yeah.
answers. And so I wonder if I wonder if they read the tea leaves and realized, look, we got to shove this into 8 episodes. And then if there's something to lead us into season 2, we'll leave that hanging. But overall, we need to answer the main questions that we're presenting here in the first 3 episodes in these next 5. So it's very possible that that's a mindset that they had here. What did you think about the mentioning of how the kids were created? Like, what did that spark in you as a avid Star Wars fan, as a person who's aware of the lore and the High Republic stuff? What did you think of hearing something like this from Mother Aniseya, saying how the kids were created, and the fear that Coral says to her, like they could find out, the Jedi could find out how these and why these kids were created. So what did you think about that as an element of the story here in this episode?
Oh, it's extremely intriguing. And I think the thing that really stood out here is up until this point in the story, these witches, outside of being called witches,
Yeah,
didn't really strike me as being inherently dark side.
not
It
at
didn't
all.
strike me as being inherently bad. I mean, they're talking about the thread, not the force, but they're two sides of the same coin, and it just doesn't sound inherently dark. And it's really not until that conversation between Mother Coral and Mother Aniseya that starts bringing things into question of like, this may not have been the miracle of life that you claim that it was. There may be something a little bit darker, a little more nefarious going on here. So that was intriguing for sure, and it definitely presents a different side of things. I mean, what stood out to you about that conversation?
You know, what shocked me, first of all, because it absolutely, how can I say this? It leveled up the game, right?
Yeah.
They're not just witches, and these children were born to certain members of the sect, and then they had to raise them, right? These are children that were created out of thin air, in essence. So this idea and power to be able to create life, that is massive in the Star Wars universe. So what is her, for lack of a better term, because she wouldn't call it this, but what is her force power to be able to create life? And we've seen, and I've seen other people referencing the Darth Plagueis conversation that Palpatine has with Anakin. This idea of Plagueis being able to create life, these allusions to that. Rumors that people have speculated and then shot down the idea that they were messing around with creating life and created Anakin, which is kind of a nebulous conversation at this point. So I thought it was a fascinating, gutsy decision to make in the 3rd season of a show that you present these new characters for the first time, these new coven of witches. You give them this force power that they call the thread, but you don't necessarily present them as negative people. I mean, when Mae and Osha are walking into the village, they're like, hi, everybody. So the way it's presented is very open and caring and loving, and they're just living their lives in this village and doing their things. And then we get to the Ascension stuff. And yes, you could maybe argue that this is some dark type of stuff, dark magic. But then again, it's their traditions and their rituals. And people getting upset about the Force. And it's like, there are multiple sects of Christianity, multiple sects of Judaism. So why wouldn't there be multiple people who would decide how to use the Force in their own particular thing 100 years before we get into what we get into with the prequels? So for me, I thought this was an interesting approach that I liked. And then adding their ability to create life, that makes me go, okay, what does this mean? What is the connective tissue? What were they trying to do? And another thing, Mother Aniseya, when Osha wants to go, she essentially says, you have a right to make a decision. Don't do it out of fear. And if you want to go and pull the thread, then go ahead and pull the thread if that's what you want to do. You'll probably never see me again. And she's crying when she says this, but she's very clear. I will talk to the council and your wishes will come into consideration. So it seems like by the time we're done with Mother Aniseya and this child that she's created, it's done. It's going to happen, Hello?
Okay, you froze there for a second, and now it looks like we're back. Sorry about that.
Okay.
We were talking about choices, and yeah, if you want to pull the thread, then pull it.
Yeah.
This was a really interesting way to sort of present this episode, and Mother Aniseya in particular, because we see her seemingly giving Osha that choice, and then we see her basically being like, "Well, I'm going to take this to the council, and
good point.
We'll take it." Like does she actually have a choice in the matter or no? It's unclear at this point whether she would act. It seems very much at first like she's, for lack of a better term, she's like the dad. She's the good guy. Mother Aniseya is like the lenient one. Like she's letting the kids have ice cream when mom is like, no, that's enough like it's that very much seems like what the relationship is from the beginning. So we're getting these different sides of her and these presentations that it's just not 100% clear which one is actually true. So I think that we're missing a lot of information here, and that's okay. This is the story that they've chosen to tell and how they've chosen to tell it. But there are a lot of things I think to fill in with her in particular, and whether or not she actually is willing to let Osha go and make this choice. I'd like to think that she is, because she does seem very much at first like a good person. And you do feel that when Osha is being dragged out of the fortress by Soul, of her screaming mama. And it just, I mean, that was heart-wrenching to see in here. But doesn't seem to be that much of that feeling doesn't seem to necessarily be there for Mother Coral. We don't see her in that wreckage, in that circle of witches that they're not burned. They just seem knocked out or dead by some other means. It doesn't look like she's in that pile, and she's not with Mother Aniseya in the next scene. So where is she in all of this? And is she going to come back into play at some point?
Yeah, because she clearly was not happy with the Jedi being there. And look, her natural nature was a strong nature. So, of course, because she's from Darth Maul's species, it makes sense, all the sense in the world. But like the approach she has, I mean, she's the one that threatens to cut the tongue out of Soul, I think, or Indara, one of the two. And she's the one that's tries to hide the kids from the Jedi and all of that. And I mean, she's a hardcore. She's the one that yells at them at the beginning when they're out in the forest, like, you're going to get spotted. Get back. No spice creams for you. And then later, when Mae uses the Force, when and Mother Aniseya is showing them and talking to them about the Ascension and showing them the use of the Force, it's Osha who hides behind Mae, but it's Mother Coral who says, I expected better of you from Osha. So clearly, she's got some very strong opinions on the Jedi, strong opinions on how you should fight the Jedi or defend yourself. And so you're right. We don't see her body. There is no close-up of her face on any of the shots there as Mae and Soul or Osha are running through the bodies there. So yeah, it's a surprising situation. Did she survive? And if she did survive, what is the end result of her surviving? And well, let's get to that. But what did you think of the ending here, Laura? We see Mae, who's upset that Osha is leaving. Certainly she's been upset throughout the whole episode that Osha isn't more committed to their relationship, committed to being part of the Ascension, committed to being a member of the Coven and defending the Coven's secrets, as we see in the Ascension as one of the chants. And then when she wants to leave, it is Mae who essentially attacks her, traps her in her room, and we see her transfixed by the fire. And the next thing you know, we hear some noises and the fire is going. Osha escapes, and then we see Mae and Osha on this separated bridge, and eventually Mae falls down the bridge, but there's fire everywhere. And when Osha opens her eyes, it's Soul who tells her, who saved her, that it was Mae who set the fire definitively. So, but Mae survived it by the tree. So what are your thoughts on this ending, this whole sequence of the ending? What do you think is going on here, and what did you think of it?
Well, there's one thing I'm sort of calling into question when it comes to Mae and that sort of initial starting of the fire, where she's holding the drawing pad and she holds up the lamp.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that the way that she's staring at that fire, just in those couple of seconds where her eyes are sort of half closed and she's staring so intently at it, I almost question, is she in like some sort of trance?
Yes.
And I've questioned in episodes 1 and 2, is this projection of young Mae that Osha is seeing? Mae is not powerful enough to do that for herself. Yeah. That's either Osha hallucinating or somebody else. There's a third party projecting that young version of Mae onto her. And I question that a little bit while that scene was playing out. All the times that I watched it, is Mae in some sort of a trance and not necessarily in control of her actions totally? Maybe that's taking too much agency away from her in this moment. I don't know. It's just an idea. It's one I haven't seen people talk about yet. Go back and watch it. I think I don't think it's completely out of the question, because she does seem to be in like a very different mood when the whole place is coming down around her. I mean, she's very desperate and almost like happy to see Osha again at that point, when it seems like they were just fighting minutes ago, although time in the show at that point, who knows, because Osha sees the fire kind of is pretty small, and she turns around and a second later it is engulfed the entire wall. So Yeah, there's definitely something fishy with that fire. I don't believe for a second that Mae started it. I
Yeah.
think it's really sketchy that Torben was so tortured by whatever the Jedi did that
Yeah.
he killed himself willingly and
Yeah.
no coercion needed whatsoever. And said, we thought we were doing the right thing. There's something there. Like, I don't like to think that the Jedi had any part in this. I really don't want to think that. But they did. There's something there, but
Yeah.
we don't know yet. And I'm really curious to see how that plays out. But I don't know. Any theories on this fire and how it grew to be what it was?
Yeah, I think you hit the Torben thing correctly, because that's what I was thinking too. And I said this in the Geek Buddies review, that it hit me because if you see one of the panels in the end of the show, Torben has the cut across his eye that we see him have when we see him meditating in the second episode. So clearly something happened, because his face was nice and clean in that interaction with the Coven of Witches there initially, but then later he has the scar at the end there when Soul is talking to Osha when she wakes up. So I think it wasn't an accident that they put in the script that Torben was Indara's Padawan. Padawan implying young, inexperienced, possibly capable of making mistakes or being irrational in a certain moment out of fear for their life or misreading something. And so I feel like Torben is the one that, because there's an explosion that happens and we hear these cacophony of voices, of screams when the explosion happens as Osha is running underneath one of those grills. And that to me is what I think is what caused the death of a majority of the women there. And we see the power grid referenced and we see it in an earlier scene in the episode. So to me, it feels like Torben might have been afraid of something, or there might have a quarrel or something might have happened, and Torben reacted in a certain way that caused the explosion. Maybe Aniseya and Coral see a majority of their coven killed by that action and then start to use the Force, and the Jedi have to fight back. So it's an unfortunate tragedy all around that causes the death of everybody but lets these Jedi live. The question is, how would Mae have seen what happened, and why is she driven for revenge now 16 years later? What is it about now that is causing her to go get revenge? And what is it that happened then that she needs to go get revenge for? And what's Soul's culpability in all of this? Because Soul is very definite when Osha wakes up that it was Mae who set the fire, and Mae killed your mom, and Mae did all these things. So I just wonder if there is a cover up here. What is the cover up, and what really happened? Because I think it's going to alleviate some of the toxicity around this show, but I also think it's going to answer some questions that those of us who are still into the show, we want to find out.
Yeah, I really am leaning towards that there's something unintentional that happens. I mean, we see in the promo footage that Kalnaka is fighting Torben. I mean, they seem to be having some sort of serious duel, sabers and all. And I wonder maybe there's some accident or something that they fall through a ceiling in this fortress, and it smashes this like coven of witches that are right below them, and it wasn't on purpose. And Soul sees it, and they're like, it was an accident, and he's part of this cover up too. I don't know. I want to think the best of the Jedi, even though they have presented in this episode as not necessarily being in the best light. I still want to think the best of them, and I think a lot of people are in that camp. So I have to think that there's, more of that story. And we know that there is, because again, we've only gotten one point of view so far, and hopefully we'll get to see others. This has just been kind of interesting how they keep setting up the end of each episode. I thought with the end of episode 2 that we'd be having like the Kalnak episode this time around. And we didn't get that. Then at the end of this episode, it almost kind of hints like, oh, maybe we'll get Mae's point of view in episode 4. But now I don't know. I'm like, they've switched it up now on me, and I can't predict what's next. So we'll see.
I can't. I've seen episode 4, so I can't say. I'm not going to speculate one way or the other, or give a hint one way or the other. But yes, there's certainly more to come, is all I'll say on episode 4. Did you have any issues with how they presented these Coven of Witches and their approach to using this thing that they call the thread, but not the Force, the way Mother Aniseya kind of displayed its ability, and this idea of using it for one, for two, for the many, it radiate that kind of protective nature of it all. But then we do see Aniseya turn Corbin's eyes black and essentially control him. So as you said, that may be a little bit of a clue there of what might have happened. Coral may have controlled Torben, as you said, and he is fighting Kelnaka in that moment. That's very possible. But what did you think of the presentation here? Did this work for you? Did the Night Sister stuff? They're kind of how can I say it's a reference or allusion to Night Sisters type of approach to the Force? Did any of this bother you as a new approach to telling to presenting these characters?
No, and I just saw an interesting tweet today
Oh.
where, and again, because I haven't seen so much of the negativity in my feed,
Mhm.
where somebody pointed out that there's like this section of the fandom that thinks that this show is retconning all of Star Wars
Yeah,
in
no.
like renaming the Force as the thread. Instead of it being like a separate, like second
Yeah.
different interpretation of the Force, that it's like completely replaced. Like, where's the rationality in that? I don't understand how anybody could come to that conclusion. Like,
Yeah.
that's just, it's
Yeah.
just preposterous. I think it's really interesting. I mean, you made a very good point in sort of bringing in this real world element, in that there are different facets of Christianity. There
Yeah.
are going to be different facets of the Force too, and the fact that we see sort of different practices of the Force in the Night Sisters, and then in the Mountain Clan that we saw in Tales of the Empire.
Oh, good
Um,
point. Yeah.
and in the Sith, and there's all kinds of, there's light and dark in all of it.
Mhm.
But I think that the thread is interesting because it instantly actually reminded me of like Greek mythology. I like Xena Warrior Princess was my favorite show growing up. And there are like the
Yeah.
fates in that show where they have like the
Right.
thread. So that it was very sort of reminiscent of that. I thought that was sort of interesting if they took any kind of inspiration from Greek mythology in that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't interpret it as being anything really unusual. I thought it made a lot of sense. It's just a sort of different way to think about what
Yeah.
we know as the Force. And even in the Force, that people have in Star Wars have different interpretations of the Force and what it means, what it can do, and whether or not it should be wielded by the Jedi. We see that story playing out in phase
Right.
2 of the High Republic. So there's all kinds of different interpretations. So it just kind of blows my mind that there would be that sort of misinterpreting of what
Mm.
this show was trying to say. But I don't know. Did anything strike you as unusual about this? I mean, did you question at any point like the validity of the thread versus the Force?
No, I liked it because I thought it was an interesting new way to look at it, and it's still adhering to the tenets of what the Force is, but putting it through a different prism so that it works for them. And I think that's really what it's all about is, and that's why we have so many different sections of Christianity or Judaism or whatever religion, is because people come upon it in different ways and they are motivated by different things, and they make the religion fit for what they want to do, right? And they create this whole story around it. Whether you want to buy it or not, it's up to you. When you're born into it, like Mormons or Scientology or all these other versions of religion or God or the energy, whatever. Native Americans having the universal energy and gods, many different gods. So there's all different ways with which you're dealing with the overall universal energy of the world. You can interpret it in many, many different ways. And so I thought it was gutsy. I thought it was bold. Did the entire show work for me? No, I still think I had issues with some of the clashing of tones, some of the childish versus the adult stake stuff. It kind of undercut it at times. But I thought overall, I thought the presentation of the way they were interpreting the Force for their particular coven worked for me. Because again, we don't hear them saying, we're going to raise these kids and they're going to go off and they're going to take control of the galaxy and we're going to spread our message and recruit everybody. None of that was here. It does not mean, though, that in future episodes we aren't going to see something that makes us look at all of this quite differently. So for now, from what I saw, I don't think I'd have an issue with it. I will tell you something I do have an issue with, and I want to get your thoughts on this. I didn't really buy the Soul Osha connection so quickly. I do, and how does Osha have the symbol of the Jedi already drawn in a notepad? What is going on here? What do you speculate is going on? How does she know about the Jedi? Why does she want to be a Jedi? Is it about just getting away from this coven, or is she really drawn or called to be this Jedi? Because as you said earlier, she walks away from the Jedi, which was what we were told in episode 1.
I questioned that a little bit too, because
Mm.
yeah, again, how would she know what the symbol is? How would she know what the Jedi even are? And how would she recognize a lightsaber hilt when she sees one? All of that seemed
Yeah.
kind of surprising to me.
Yeah.
I think that might be a matter of how long has this coven been in isolation
Mm.
on and off in this fortress, and how much of Osha and May's life did they spend outside of that fortress, just kind of existing in the galaxy with the rest of their coven, and probably a community of other people around them that aren't necessarily within the coven, just happen to be within the same vicinity. So I don't know. I wonder about that because it seems like they are in a position in this episode, the coven, where they want to be isolated. I mean, the Jedi say we thought this planet was uninhabited. We saw that there appear to be other people in this village, in this fortress that they're living in, that aren't part of the coven. But I wonder, maybe that's the whole point for them now, to just be as isolated as possible. They haven't maybe always been, and that's so these girls maybe grew up having some exposure to other people and other cultures, and one of them happened to have been the Jedi. That's the way I can justify this in my mind, because I kind of questioned that too. I'm like, she notices right away. She's like, oh, look at their sabers. I'm like, why do you even know what that is?
Yeah, right. It's a good point. Exactly. And what do you think of the scene where they're being questioned here? I mean, we shades of Anakin being questioned by the council in the prequel trilogy, and then getting the blood taken out, essentially the midichlorians reference there, Torben taking the blood. And then her interactions with Kelnaka, I thought were really sweet and immediately had chemistry there and care for them. And she couldn't lie, whereas Mae lied comfortably, clearly, though we didn't see that scene inside the ship. What did you think of that sequence there? What were they trying to say in this episode about the testing here between the two of them?
I think the thing that stood out most to me in these scenes is that Indara is very cold. We got that from episode 1, and we continue to get that this episode. And I think that rubbed off on Torben, because when he's interacting with Osha while he's taking her blood, it's a very like disconnected, detached, sort of cold attitude. Well, he got that from somewhere, and I'm guessing it's Indara. So it was just kind of interesting to see how that relationship has kind of developed in some ways. We haven't got a ton with them, but I thought it was interesting. The kind of the repeat of some of the Phantom Menace stuff in the test, I thought was kind of cool, to be honest. I'm glad they didn't drag it out too long. We're just going with 2 images needing to identify. So I think it worked. The Soul and Mae stuff, I don't know if it necessarily bothered me or didn't work for me in the same way that it didn't work for you.
Okay.
I thought it was kind of okay. I think he has more chemistry with Amanda Stenberg than he does with this child actor. But I also, the first watch through of this episode, I struggled with these child actors a little bit. This was a lot of the kids in focus in this episode, and it was just kind of wearing me down a little bit. So it was fine after my first watch through. My second and third were more enjoyable in that aspect of things, but this was a lot. I will be very curious to see if we get Mae's test too. It feels repetitive to go back and show that again. But I would still also be curious to see it. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, how could they do something really that different beyond just showing her lying? And obviously they detect it in Osha and they call her out on it. Did they call out Mae in that, or did they just let go? Be curious to find out.
That's quizzical, right? Yeah, because you would think they'd be able to see through Mae, and especially if they're master Jedi, like Indara seems to have been presented as. I think Soul is a younger Jedi in at that time, and clearly 16 years before, but also just inexperienced. So I think it's very clear that it's Indara who's leading this whole thing. So I would imagine she would have been able to see who this was, right? And see if she was lying. And so maybe they knew about Mae, but it's not Mae who they wanted. It was Osha who they wanted, which is what lays the groundwork for what happened, lays the groundwork for what more of the mystery of why they were okay with Mae lying to them and letting her go. And it was Osha who seems to be who they really wanted, because Soul creates a connection with her very quickly. He doesn't talk to Mae in that sequence with the 4 Jedi and the Coven of Witches. He talks to Osha immediately, right? Even though he says both of them should come to be tested, it's Osha who they gravitate to in the end. And so that's the question there when he carries the guilt of Mae's death, even though it didn't seem from what I saw and what we got presented that he was somehow at fault for Mae dying. I thought they were both hanging off a cliff and he chose to save Osha. It was that that thing went down and there was nothing he could do about it with his force powers. And so I don't know why he carries the guilt of it. when he saved Osha at the end. So was he involved in some way? Was the accident, was whatever happened there between the witches and these 4 Jedi, it was Soul a part of it, and that may have led May to do what she was doing, or run out of the area and then get onto that scaffold or that bridge walkway and fall and die. I don't know, possibly die. Obviously, well, not die, but what he thought she died. And so that's my question that I have coming out of all of that overall, and a great de-aging job on Soul, for God's sakes. He looks so young.
Yeah. I did wonder about this. I'm like, how much money did they spend de-aging Indara and Soul? Because wow, like they look incredible, like just incredible. It also just occurred to me in this moment, we talking about how Indara is so like kind of cold and detached. I'm realizing right now, as we're talking about Phantom Menace, she was off very Mace Windu. It's very Mace Windu coded from Phantom Menace. And that is fascinating, actually, to think about. And we already know how she dies, which is just, I don't know how they're going to go back and connect it again, but it just is, I wonder what the direction was when they sat down and they're like, how do you want to play this? How should we make this Jedi different than the others? And we're like, well, let's just make her Mace Windu. So I wonder. I don't know. But overall, I like how it played out. This is all very intriguing. I think it's setting us up for some really interesting stuff, especially if we really are going to come back and revisit all of this from hopefully not too many points of views. I would like to come back to the present and actually explore more with these characters, check back in with Jack and Yord and see what's going on here and how maybe they feel about all of this. Because from what we've gotten from them, we know that they're very anti-attachment and seem to be a little bit more in the Indara, at least Yord comes off as being a lot more kind of uptight. Jackie may be a little bit more pliable in that sense. I would like to check back in with some of those characters and jump back into the present and get a little bit more with Amandla and a little bit less with the child actors. But that's just me personally. I don't know. I
don't think you're wrong on that. I think that quite a few people have speculated that they did not like some of the performances from the two young actresses, unfortunately. But like, I don't know if that's script. I don't know if that's direction. I don't know if that's editing. You don't know sometimes with these kinds of situations. But I agree with you. The stronger acting is Amandla Stenberg doing both of these characters in the present day of the show. And we'll see when they come back to the present what this all means for us as viewers of the show. But I thought it was a good episode to just flesh out that mystery a little bit. It may not be the actual overall truth of what happened, but we have an idea of what happened. And now we have something to connect to on Brendock that we can go back to in our minds when we're seeing things referenced. And then when things change, we will be able to use that as a foundational thing to compare. And I think that's coming out probably in the next few episodes in certain ways. So for me, I like the episode. I think it was great. I still think the two of them fighting while Aniseya was doing a thing, I thought that was a bit clunky and odd and a little too childish to compare. Because the way I think of it is, you're seeing Aniseya use Mother Aniseya use the Force for the first time. You don't want to be distracted by two kids playing around. Focus on what she can do. Then you can move the camera and see them fighting and whatever, doing as kids do. And that was believable. It was just the way it was shot, pulled focus from what Aniseya was doing. And I thought that wasn't necessary overall in how they presented that. But certainly I'm left with some more interest in the show and wanting to see where it goes in the next few episodes. Overall, is there anything we missed, Laura, that you want to make sure we hit on or highlight or talk about from your notes or anything?
Whoever came up with Spice Cream, I feel like they were like, oh, I'm so clever. I'm going to put this word in the script like 8 times. And somebody else in the writer's room was like, hey, you're kind of saying Spice Cream a lot. Like maybe pull back and take some of out. And the other person who wrote it was like, no, I'm going to do more Spice Cream. It just like kind of hammered a lot. I could have used less. It was fine. I'm like, I get it. You guys think you're cute and clever. Less, please.
It's a little bit of the synergy here because the Spice Creams, for those of you who may not know, the Cavalian Spice Creams, they are from the 2019 recipe book, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, the official Black Spire Outpost cookbook, there by Mark Sumerak and Chelsea Monroe Castle. And there is a whole recipe so you can make spice creams at your house. If you'd like to make spice creams, there's a whole recipe there for you all to use. So a little bit of synergy using Galaxy's Edge stuff with the Acolyte and using a treat from there. But those things look good. They're like a softer macaroon. So I'm down. I'm down to have a few of those if I ever make them or go back to Galaxy's Edge. Maybe they sell them now that the Acolyte is out. Yeah, I think I think this is a great breakdown here, Laura. Our own spoiler review of this particular episode. We miss Kevin, but Kevin will be back next week. He'll have some thoughts. I'm sure some Darth Plagueis thoughts. Because a lot of people were speculating about that here in this episode for sure. But thank you so much for watching it. Please remember to subscribe to the channel down below. Hit that bell button. Let us know what you thought about everything. What stood out to you? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? Keep it civil. We'd appreciate you keeping it civil. We don't need any toxicity here. You can still have strong opinions. Just present them in a way that isn't necessarily attacking others. Just present your strong opinions in a much more tactful way that can be responded to and have conversations on, because I think that's a fun part of critiquing Star Wars. Let us know down in the comments section below. Laura, thanks so much. Another fun show here. Please let people know where they can find you and any final words you might have about this episode. Or the Acolyte.
I think I said all I think I need to say. Most of what I have to say when it comes to Star Wars is on my Twitter. So if you come find me on Twitter, it is at @shutup_Laura. I am often talking about Star Wars. More recently, I'm often talking about the High Republic. Even most recently, I'm talking a lot about The Temptation of the Force, which is the most recent High Republic adult novel that just came out. I will also be talking about that book on several of my friends' podcasts, including Now This Is Lit, Rogue Rebels, and Jam Transmissions. So be on the lookout for those. I wrote a spoiler-free review of the novel on my Twitter and my Instagram. You can find it in both places, same handle. And I was just recently on what was it called? The Resistance broadcast. We discussed episode 3 of The Acolyte with John Hoey and Lacey Gillerin. I was really excited to sit down and actually chat with them about that. I hadn't spent a lot of time talking to either of them, so that was a fun adventure. But you can find that on their YouTube and their podcast feed as well.
Absolutely. TRB is great. And I almost sent in a Streamlab or a super chat just to mess with you a little bit, because it was an hour and a half and I was always going to be like, hey, Laura's gone into overtime here. Send her some stuff, some payment here. She's gone into OT past that hour. But yeah, really fun conversation with those people as well. I love John and Lacey. So great to see that you were on the show. I've been on there a few times and I always enjoy my time. So no surprise that you did as well. All right. That's our show. Thank you very much for joining us. And Laura, what do we have to tell them before we go?
Always remember, your focus determines your reality.